This is Duke University.
I'm John Bewin. I'm with the Center for Documentary Studies and Audio Program, director there in the Doc Studies program. And radio is one of the currents of this conversation, among others. And I'm pleased to introduce Sonja Williams, who is a professor in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film at Howard University, Washington, D.C. And she is a longtime and award-winning radio producer, having done much work, especially on African American history, black radio, black sacred music, among other things. And now she is an author. And a lot of the conversation today will be about her new book, Word Warrior. It's a biography of Richard Durham, a really important but underknown, if that's a word I can manufacture, African-American radio journalist that we'll hear more about as the conversation goes on. I'm really pleased to have Sonja here.
Thank you.
And in conversation with her, Charlie Cobb, who is a longtime and noted civil rights activist, author, also a radio journalist, worked for NPR for years, a lot of things. He's a visiting scholar here, working on an amazing project that is going on largely through the Center for Documentary Studies, doing a history of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that Charlie was involved in the 1960s, the amazing work that they did in the South, Southern Civil Rights Movement. So I think I'll shut up now and get out of the way and let these two talk. Maybe we can just welcome them.
I'm waiting to hear more about the book. Although I've read it.
Do you have a specific question?
No, I didn't repeat what I told you, I think, earlier this afternoon. I mean, Durham was, for me, just a name. I mean, he's an older generation. He's from the older generation of black journalists. Oh, I should say black journalists / advocates, because they, for the most part, were on a distinct mission, to use the phrase Marcus Garvey used when he was active in the United States, a mission aimed at the redemption and vindication of the race. But Durham, older journalists, black journalists, would talk about him. I'm thinking of Larry Still, who undoubtedly you knew, or Vernon Jarrett, Ethel Payne, Simeon Booker. These names probably don't mean much to you all, but these are the journalists who in the 40s and 50s were doing things like going underground to investigate lynchings. These were the journalists who traveled with the Freedom Riders in 1961. These are the journalists like Larry Still talked to me once, an older journalist. He was with Jet Magazine, sneaking in to the coroner's office, I guess is the word I want, to covertly take photographs of Emmett Till's body. And as it was there because it was being watched. All this handful of black journalists who covered the South. And one of the points I was making to Sonja was, one of the reasons I appreciated her book, not only for its biographical information on Durham himself, but almost all of that generation of black journalists that I knew personally, or even knew of, or reported on the South. I didn't have a story about journalists in places like Chicago or New York or something like that. Her book kind of fills in that void in my own knowledge, as well as makes Durham himself something more than a name that other older journalists told me was an important person, particularly the Chicago journalists, and even people outside of that. I am pretty close to Hockey Mike Bruce, and I was close to Glenn Brooks.
Because I did review Hockey.
Yeah, and they referenced him, particularly when they knew I was a reporter, and if I showed up in Chicago, they would say, "Well, you need to talk to Richard Durham." And I say, "You're right, first, who's he?" And so I never did. I never met the man. I never had a single conversation with him, either face-to-face or on the telephone. So I didn't know much beyond people I respected him, until I read Sonja's book, because I personally think the whole story of black journalism is undertold in this country, going all the way back to the 19th century. And certainly the post-World War II journalists have a real story that is just ignored in the journalism schools, not in the public consciousness, and in many, many respects, given the odds that they were up against, quite an amazing story.
Well, just to give you a little bit of background, Richard Durham spent 61 of his 66 years in Chicago. His family was really part of the Great Migration. They moved from Mississippi to Chicago in 1923. He was born in 1917, so he would have been 98 years old if he was alive today. And in fact, this month is his birth month. He was born in September 6th to be exact. His wife is still alive. She's 95. She'll be 96 in November. And she is the short, petite powerhouse. She's my hero, along with Richard Durham, because she still drives, which is kind of scary in Chicago. But she's a good driver. She really is a good driver. And she exercises at the Wabash Y 2 times a week. She's involved in all of these boards and organizations. She's scary. She's wonderful. But I wish that her husband was still alive, because I would have loved to have spoken with him. And I didn't get a chance to meet him, even though I went to school in Chicago. I lived literally, when I was a freshman in college, a few blocks away from his home. But I didn't know anything about him then, and really didn't discover him until the 90s, when I was working for the Smithsonian Institution. And in the 90s, from the late 80s to the 90s, the Smithsonian had a unit in the National Museum of American History that was a documentary unit, and it was designed to produce radio and television documentaries about the American experience. So I had the real distinct pleasure to be hired as a producer for a series called Black Radio, Telling It Like It Was. And it was a 13-part series to air on national, well, no, it wasn't National Public Radio, but Public Radio International, which was another offshoot, that looked at the history of blacks in radio from the beginning of radio to the 90s. And when I was hired, one of the shows in that series looked at blacks on air in the 30s and 40s. Well, if you know anything about, even if you don't know anything about radio in the 30s and 40s, that was what we called the golden age of radio, when radio was like television or even the internet today. It was the entertainment central mass medium in households. It was the most popular medium, along with film, of its time. And it had a variety of shows: comedies, dramas, variety shows, music. But the thing that it also reflected was the tenor of the time, and that was segregation. So if you heard a black voice on the air, inevitably it was a stereotypical voice, or a voice of of a maid or butler or some poorly speaking African American who was uneducated and, you know, really negative stereotypes. Durham grew up listening to the radio, and one of the things that he heard was he was a teen or even a preteen when the most popular program that came on in 1929 was Amos and Andy. You've all heard of Amos and Andy? Yes? No? Maybe so? Okay.
I wouldn't count on it.
Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah, right. Well, Amos and Andy was a comedy, a 15-minute comedy show. At least it started off as 15 minutes. And most shows during the 30s and even the early 40s were 15 minutes long, as opposed to what we know now, that if you're going to have a drama, it's going to be half an hour or an hour. Well, back in the early days of radio, there were 15-minute slots. And so Amos and Andy came on in Chicago in 1928, and it became so popular that NBC picked it up, and it became a national phenomenon. I mean, it was as popular as, give me a really popular show today, television. Breaking Bad.
I was just going to say
You were going to say it?
I don't want to though.
What were you going to say?
House of Cards.
House of Cards. Okay. Huh?
Glee.
That's great. House of Cards.
Glee. Maybe for us, but I don't know. Glee for, yeah. Anyway, people would stop doing what they were doing. In movie theaters, they would stop playing the movie so that they can then broadcast the show in the theaters. It was that popular. But there was also two white men, two white vaudevillians, who portrayed these black characters. And so if you didn't know that they were white, you would think that there were these black actors who were on air doing these funny things every day. It became a daily show, but at times, whenever it was on, it was like the thing. And yet, here were two guys who were supposedly up from the South into the urban North, and they couldn't speak English properly. They were really negative stereotypes. And so Durham heard this, and he knew that in his neighborhood and in his family and around Black Chicago, there were many more African Americans who were a lot more positive than what he heard on the air. So I'm sure, I mean, he never said that per se, but I think from given his history that he probably said, oh, wait a minute, you know, this can be a whole lot better. So fast forward to he's now in his he's in his late teens. He gets into poetry. He loves writing poetry and reading it, and he really admires people like James Weldon Johnson and Langston Hughes. And so he's an audacious kind of guy. He really decided, okay, I've been writing some poetry. He was able to get some of his poems published in the Chicago Defender, which was the black newspaper, not just in Chicago, but was distributed nationwide, and the Pittsburgh Courier, which was also like that, and then other news magazines of the day. And so he sends Langston Hughes his poems and says, you know, I'm a poet, and could you read my poems and tell me what you think? Well, first of all, he'd never met Langston. Langston is now a renowned, worldwide, renowned poet and writer. And he was traveling all over the world. But Langston, incredibly enough, writes Durham back and says, you know, your poems showed some talent. And not only that, but he takes each of the poems that Durham had sent and critiques them in the margins. And I talk about that in the book. As a result of that communication, they become lifelong friends, and they remain friends and even collaborators. They work on some projects together until Langston Hughes dies in 1967. At any rate, because of his poetry background and because he was published, he applies to the WPA. And if you know about the Depression, the WPA was the Roosevelt administration's attempt to get Americans back to work. But not only was the WPA about trying to get American men and women back to work in construction or other areas, it was also to get artists to work. Whether you worked in the theater, whether you were a visual artist, whether you were a writer. What else? It was the Writers Project, it was a theater project. Photography. It was really phenomenal. And in fact, when we went through the recession a few years ago, and still kind of coming out of it, people said we should have a WPA-like project to get people back into the working world. So
WPA stands for Works Progress Administration.
Right, right. And the Works Progress Administration was a federal program, but each state in the United States had a state program, and then they ran programs out of it. So the Illinois project had an Illinois Writers Project. Durham applied because he was a published author. He got in, and now he's in this fantastic universe of these writers who would go on to be some, really Pulitzer Prize winning and award winning artists. People like Nelson Algren or Saul Bellow. Black writers like Arnold Bontemps, who was then an established writer, and he became Durham's supervisor. Margaret Walker and Catherine Dunham, who would go on to be a dance choreographer for now. So he's in this environment, and one day he's in the Illinois Writers Project headquarters, and he looks over and there's a conference table, a lot smaller than, say, this area, but there are a group of young men and women sitting around there, and they're discussing, they're arguing, and they're really getting into it. And he goes over to check them out, and as he finds out, this is the radio division of the Illinois Writers Project. And literally, these 20 or so men and women every week are writing scripts for radio programs that will be broadcast on local Chicago stations. They're original dramas, but they're also adaptations of classics by people like Edgar Allan Poe and Anton Chekhov. He becomes friends with a man that you may or may not, any Chicagoans in the room? Okay, so you know Studs Terkel? Mm-hmm. Heard? Okay. Studs was the man. He just died a couple years ago. Yeah, at 90-something. 97, 98, somewhere in there. Who's counting? But he was the man, and he and Durham became really good friends. And they wrote scripts for these local programs. So that's how Richard Durham got into radio. He was one, actually, of very few black writers. In fact, you could count the number of writers who wrote for radio in the 30s. This is 1939, 1940, 1941, on probably one hand and one or two fingers. So he was in rare company, but he learned his craft well. They met every week. They critiqued each other's scripts, and inevitably, a week or two later, those scripts ended up on the air. So it was a great training ground, right? And as a result, he fell in love with the fact that not only could he listen to the dramas that were on air at the time, but now he's producing them. He was never an on-air personality. He was always the behind-the-scenes guy who wrote the scripts that were then enacted by professional actors, literally actors who came out of the Goodman Theater in Chicago, if you know anything about the theater world there. So fast forward, the WPA, Illinois Writers Project, ends about the early 40s, 42, 43, and then he freelances, and he becomes a writer of all things, The Lone Ranger, you've heard of that, for radio. And most of the things that most of the long-running shows, even the soap operas, started on radio and then migrated to this thing called television that came about in the late 40s. So he's writing for that and for soap operas and really getting this great experience. And then fast forward to the end of the 40s, he decides, I want to present dignified images of black men and women heroes, leaders in their field and in a range of fields. So everything from a Harriet Tubman or a Sojourner Truth abolitionist or a Denmark Vesey or a Frederick Douglass to contemporary people like boxer Sugar Ray Robinson or Hazel Scott, who was a phenomenal pianist and musician, to Jay Boland, who was a wonderful lawyer in New York City, dealt with children's rights. So he's got this cache of wonderful people, both known and lesser known, and he's dramatizing their lives on air every week from June 1948 to August 1950. I wanted to, if it's okay, play just a few minutes of one of the pieces. This is going to feature Studs Terkel. Studs was actually trying out his acting hands in the 40s. He was known as a radio personality, an interviewer in his later life, and of course a Pulitzer Prize winning writer. But in the 40s, and as a result of his experience with the Illinois Writers Project radio division, he also tried his hand in acting. So in 1948, Durham writes a script about this gentleman who had just integrated the major leagues, baseball. You know who that is? Jackie Robinson, which was contemporary history at that time. In fact, it wasn't history, it had just happened. So he's literally, and I say this to my students, but if you think about Law and Order, what is Law and Order's claim to fame? In terms of what it does on a weekly basis. It snatches
out of the news, right?
Yeah, it snatches their stories from the headlines. And that's essentially what he did when he dealt with contemporary issues. So I'm going to play just a few minutes of this piece about Jackie Robinson. The setup is that Robinson is, I won't describe it, I'll let you hear because I think it's really well done. But the other thing is that Durham approached each of his scripts and each and every of his subjects very differently. So in this case, this is called The Rhyme of the Ancient Dodger. And Studs Terkel plays a Dodger fan who is this mystical kind of guy who sees and hears everything that goes on with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he's got this New York accent, and he sounded like, this Dodger fan from way back, and he does that. But one other thing that he does is that both Studs Terkel's narration, his dialogue is almost totally in rhyme. Not completely, but it's in rhyme. And he does this along with dramatizing the fact that Jackie Robinson enters this really kind of hostile feel in the 40s. So this is it, and the voice you'll hear will be, the first voice will be Studs.
Hold still, babe. Here it goes. I was at Ebbets Field at my post in the bleachers, investigating for un-Brooklyn activities. I'm sitting in the crowd, unseen, invisible, watching the fans root for the boys like only Dodger fans can do. And what a show! I know, well do I know. It was a sight to see when the ump called him right. You could hear him about 10 miles from the gate when a ball was called that missed the plate. Ball 2! When he was right, we give the ump his due.
And this was all produced live in the studio.
I'm the best man on our team.
Oh, I love that ump. I would carve a hair on that ump's head. I love that ump.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. But when the ump called it wrong, strike 3, we had another song.
Plate. You louse, you look for your teeth. You're blind. Get yourself a seeing-eye dog. Kill the arm.
Where's my pistol? Will somebody go over and get my pistol? Please get my pistol.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. Pleasant and gentle. True Brooklyn activities going on as usual. And then it happened. It starts when this new Dodger comes to the plate.
The next batter for Brooklyn will be first baseman Jackie Robinson.
There was umpires everywhere. and the pitcher hadn't thrown a ball. But when this Robinson ups to the plate, some ghostly umpire calls.
Strike two.
Did you hear that? Did you hear him?
Yeah, I heard it.
But you didn't say nothing. You was quiet, like the bleachers was. Here was a umpire calling 2 strikes on a man before he gets the bat. And the bleachers was quiet like that. Then my second sense starts operating. I put my whammy in action.
Please don't put it on me.
Be still, babe. I put it on Jackie Robinson. I give him the double reverse flashback whammy so I could see where the second strike comes from. I tie my nerves and my muscles together and threw my double whammy, not my triple, mind you, just my double whammy. And what do you know? I'm in some foreign country, Chicago, seeing this guy Jackie Robinson in the year 1943. And some citizens is out practicing baseball.
Foreigners sure imitate us Brooklyners, don't they?
Yeah. Well, there I am in 1943 in Comiskey Park. And this Jackie Robinson's working out with his team, Kansas City Monarchs. I'm looking around, and guess who I see standing there?
I ain't got the slightest idea.
2 of the scouts from our own beautiful bums. Clyde Sukfort and Taylor, and they're watching Robinson working out. And every time Robinson gets near the plate, I hear this up call.
Strike two.
And I hear the scouts talking.
Sure, Robinson's got 2 strikes on him before he steps up to the plate. Any colored player who tries to crash the major leagues got 2 strikes on him. That don't cut no ice.
Yeah, that's what they tell me, Taylor.
So I think you get it. But the point is that he used all kind of inventive, creative ways. And then I'll let, if you have some questions, because what he did was, after setting this up, then you actually heard Robinson, played by Oscar Brown Jr., who was a phenomenal actor, singer, and entertainer. So Robinson comes in and he goes in to meet Branch Ritchie, who's the president of the Dodgers. And he says, well, we think we might want to bring you in. We've heard that you're a great player, but we have to check you out. And you probably will get some feedback and flack. And Robinson says, well, if you want me to, there's no way that I can do this without standing up for myself. And he said, well, if that's the case, then you may not want me because I'm not going to swing and deal with the discrimination and segregation on my knees. And Branch Ritchie says, no, let's check you out and have you go through a tryout period, and then he eventually becomes a Dodger. So he found creative ways and methods to talk about racism, the fact that simply because Jackie Robinson was black, that there was 2 strikes against him before he stepped up to the plate, and he had to be better than his white counterparts, and eventually became a Dodger, a major player on the Dodgers team. So it was that kind of thing that really drew me in, and I said, who is this guy that's writing this stuff? And he would find creative ways to kind of get the audience into it. For instance, there was an episode that he talked about the life and contributions of Louis Armstrong, the singer, trumpeter. And so he had Louis Armstrong's trumpet be the narrator. Or in another one about the Heart of George Cotton, which really looks at the career of a phenomenal African-American surgeon named Dr. Ulysses Grant Daly. And so the heart was part narrator. And so you get this dum, 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 and it kind of goes throughout. So it's that kind of thing that he did, but it was always in the service of promoting positive social change and freedom, justice, and equality for everyone, regardless of their race and their background. And so that was his kind of claim to fame. Did you want to?
No, I have nothing to add.
Let me show you, I wanted to bring up All right, so here is Durham. All right, so here's Richard in the 1940s. This is him in his home studio. Well, it wasn't a studio, it really was the corner of a dining room, and he would write there. And this is him working on the script. You actually see the script at the bottom corner there. And these are the men. Janice Kingslow was one of the regulars. He had actually an ensemble cast, and it was an integrated cast, by the way, as well as the crew, who were just about all white. In fact, they were all white at WMAQ NBC, which is where this show aired. But Janice Kingslow was a regular, along with these other folks. There's Oscar Brown Jr. on the left, Harris Gaines, Jack Gibson, who became a really well-known on-air personality in Atlanta, wasn't until then as an actress, and Fred Pinkard would go on to become Bill Cosby's father. He would play Bill Cosby's father in one of the Cosby iterations, not the 1984 Cosby Show. So this is the cast, and this was an advertisement for Destination Freedom from back in the 40s. And they had a Sunday evening, the show aired on Sunday mornings from 10 to 10:30, and then Sunday evenings to help promote the show, there you could go to this place and meet some of the actors. This is in the studio in WMAQ, and so this is a table read of the script. Now, if you think about it, he is writing a script every single week. Even on television shows like a Breaking Bad or a Glee or whatever, you have a bank of writers, and they might be assigned to write one show every 3 or 4 weeks. So there are other people to take up the slack in between. But in his case, because he was so clear that he wanted his vision and his voice to be clear about in the show, he was the writer. Now, he's not in this particular scene, but the actors, the guy sitting in the middle at the head of the table, his name was Homer Heck, and he was the director of the series, an NBC employee. This is just the cover page of one of his scripts, and this is what the script looked like. And this was a Harriet Tubman script. But here is Oscar Brown Jr., Wesley Tilden, and Fred Pinkard literally in the studio performing. This was probably taken in 1949. Here is that organ you heard, is the organist. So literally in the studio, as the actors are doing their thing at the microphone, the organist has the script, and he knows where the music breaks are, and they've worked that out. This is the cast at one of the the first anniversary of the show. And so the show, again, remained on until 1950. Because it was so popular, particularly in the black community, but also for the general public in Chicago, Durham wanted to do what happened with Amos and Andy, and that was take the show national. Usually a lot of shows started off as a national broadcast, a local broadcast, and then if it became popular and they could find sponsors, then it would migrate to the national network. Well, NBC clearly had affiliates everywhere in this country, and so Durham wanted the show to become a national phenomenon. Well, NBC essentially and WMAQ said no. Why do you think they said no?
Black show.
It was a black show, definitely, and
Southern radio stations.
Southern stations would say, really? No, we're not airing that. And if you even think we would, so they're talking about losing potential revenue from their not being able to air the show in on Southern stations. So he said, okay, I'm going to take this show national one way or another, and I'm probably going to do it myself. So he finds backers, and they say, yes, we're ready, and we're not only going to try to do it nationally on radio, but we're going to try to move into this new medium called television. So it goes off the air in August, and then in October of 1950, he turns around and he's looking in the paper one day in Chicago, and there's this advertisement for the return of this award-winning series called, guess what? Destination Freedom. But this time, WMAQ is sponsoring it totally. They're appropriating his name, which was copyrighted by him. And they're making the show about all white heroes. She said, oh, guess what? No, that's not going to happen. So he gets a lawyer, they try to negotiate, and they claim that he's a staff writer. He had never been hired by NBC. He was literally a contract worker. He was paid on a script-by-script basis. They said they came up with the name of the show. They didn't. They said they owned the rights, and they didn't. So he does what any good American would do. He sued. But this is 1950. He's a black man suing a major network. He's crazy. But he said, this is my baby. This was my sweat and tears, along with my colleagues who we worked on this together, and there's no way that NBC is going to claim that this series about these black men and women is yours. So he sued, and of course it wound its way through the legal system, which I talk about here. So that gets you to the 50s. And then finally, because he sues NBC, which is, like David and Goliath, he is a person non grata in the broadcast industry. So he can't work in both radio or television now, and he has to find other work. One other thing about Durham was that he was able to, throughout his life, find ways to make a living as a writer solely. He never worked in any other field, but he was also versatile enough so that he could write for radio, which has its own peculiarities, and he could write for print, the Chicago Defender, and he could write, as he does here, for one of the most progressive unions in Chicago, the United Packing House Workers of America, which represented all of the workers who worked in the stockyards in Chicago. So he works there, and he's a writer and an organizer. Starts off as a consultant, and then they love his work so much that they hired him full-time. And he does that, and as a result of that, he gets to work on, or send people down to Mississippi, his home state, to deal with the Emmett Till case and the trial of the men who actually did kill Emmett Till, but they were quickly acquitted. He doesn't go himself, but he sends representatives from the union. And he also gets a chance to meet with and work with a young 26-year-old minister from the South who is heading this bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. Who am I talking about? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who comes up to Chicago to raise money so that the bus boycott, which was then about 3 months old, can continue. So there's all this connection that's going on. You talked about Emmett Till, and Emmett Till in 1955 was really kind of a flashpoint for many in the black community to see that this 14-year-old kid was mutilated and killed supposedly because he whistled at a white woman, right? And then you spoke with Simeon Booker, and he talked about what was it like in that?
The story I read, when I spent a long time talking, Simeon Booker was a reporter for Jet magazine. He eventually, by that time, he was head of the Washington bureau for Jet magazine. And I should say as a sidebar before, because it gives you some indication of life in sort of mainstream white organizations, if you were a reporter. Simeon was the first black reporter hired by the Washington Post. And he quit. The reason he quit was because he was asked not to use the bathrooms on the editorial floors, lest he offend someone by using the bathroom on the editorial floor. The white bathroom, there's no signs, of course, saying white only, but he nevertheless was asked by his higher-ups or supervisor. So he quit. And this is in the 50s, I forget the exact year. I think this is when he actually takes over, or maybe even opens the Washington Bureau, Jet magazine, the most news-oriented, if you will, Johnson publications that came out of Chicago. So he goes down, well, they actually jets sent a whole team down to cover the trial in 1955. And what I remember Simeon, aside from Simeon talking about how scared he was, but he had never been to Mississippi. He's from Baltimore. And he told me the prosecutor, two stories he told me. The prosecutor wanted to segregate the reporters. There were a handful of black reporters, not many, maybe a half dozen or so actually was present covering the trial. They were all living together on the estate of T.R.M. Howard. That's a whole other story about this black doctor in Mississippi. But the prosecutor, and he wanted to segregate. He did not, he wanted, the sheriff did not want black reporters in the courtroom itself in Sumner, Mississippi. The judge said it would be okay if they sat at separate tables. So there was a little card table, Simeon said, for the black reporter. And what Simeon remembers is the sheriff, Strider, every morning they would, as they settled in at the table, the sheriff would walk up to the table and look at them and say, "Good morning, niggas," and then proceed on his way. And Simeon is telling me this story, and Simeon's in his 90s too. You know, it's the older guy telling the younger guy, you know, let me tell you what it was really like. He said he was walking down the street one day and he got stopped. Sumner, Mississippi is a little bitty town, less than 1,000 people. He got stopped by a fairly elderly white woman as he's walking from somewhere in the town. She stops him and she looks at him and says, "I know you ain't from here, 'cause niggas don't wear those kind of eyeglasses." And I said, it was like an alien universe, he was telling me, and that what you had to do was remind yourself constantly that you were there to get the story. That's how Simeon described it. And I think there were a lot of these guys, not just, the Emmett Till murder was the most famous of these killings and trials, but there was a core of black reporters. You know, I never talked to the two guys from the Baltimore Afro-American who traveled with the Freedom Riders, that first group of Freedom Riders, and what it was like for them on that bus, especially when the bus got bombed. But it just seems to me that there's a story to be told that has yet to be told about the exceptional courage of these guys going into a murderously violent South, armed with nothing essentially except a notebook and a pen. And if they try to do what Simeon said he was trying to do in Sumner, Mississippi, get the story, their lives were at continual risk, because it did not take long for them to be identified. It's kind of the accusation being that you're trying to undermine, quote, our way of life with your presence and writing the story. Even in the 60s, when I worked in Mississippi, I worked in Mississippi from 1962 until 1967. That was, the first thing you learned was there was hardly any way to be invisible in these towns and counties. They knew you were there the day after you got there. You had a target on your back. The only guy who got away with invisibility was Walter White, who was the executive secretary for the NACP in the 1940s and 50s, because he was very fair-skinned, had blonde hair, and blue eyes. and he could be invisible as he investigated lynchings and conditions. In the South. Guys
And it's
like-
interesting because Durham, one of his Destination Freedom scripts was about Walter White and the fact that he was almost like a spy. He'd go in and see what was happening and then get out because he didn't look.
Yeah, I mean, he could pass.
Yeah.
And if he got into trouble for anything, it probably would be, if he's in Mississippi, he didn't sound like a Mississippian. Or if he was in Alabama, he didn't sound like an Alabaman. But these guys, there's a whole story, and they range all over the map politically. I admire them for their courage. I don't pay much attention to where they are in the political sense. I mean, there's a real difference between Richard Durham, political attitude, and say Carl Rowan, who also was a reporter for the Minneapolis Tribune. I think. Well, they didn't write for Black Minneapolis Tribune. As they work, but all of these guys, at least the ones I've talked to, saw themselves as being on a mission.
Durham was definitely on a mission, and so by the 60s, he becomes the editor of Muhammad Speaks, which was the national newspaper of the Nation of Islam. So you would say, okay, well, did he become a Muslim? No. Was he interested in what the nation particularly was doing? Well, you know, in some of their programs, yes. But his idea was that I want to take my philosophy that all people are created equal and there should be universal freedom, justice, and equality, and use this organ, this newspaper, to be able to talk about conditions around the world, not just in the United States. So this is Elijah Muhammad, who was the head of the Nation of Islam, and you'll notice behind Elijah is Muhammad Ali, because he had joined the nation in the early 60s, and then next to him is Farrakhan, who is currently still the Nation of Islam today. But his news coverage in the Muhammad Speaks was a range of issues. It dealt with lynching in the United States, what was happening in southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and what was going on in Vietnam. And one of the things you talked about, going into a town and being careful about what you were, Durham, as the editor, sent one of his reporters to a small town in Virginia because there had been reports that black women, young black women, were being forcibly sterilized. So he says, well, we need to investigate this. Let me send you down there. And this brother goes down, a reporter. He was actually the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the paper, which was based in Chicago. So he goes down and he interviews some of these women and they tell him their story. He also goes to the hospital or the clinic where these sterilizations happen and he interviews some nurses there. And someone gets wind that some northern reporter is down here checking on this. Now this is 1967, so now we're even later. So just to tell you that the whole idea of racial discrimination and segregation was still pretty serious. And someone comes to him who lived in the area and said, man, they know that you're here. They know how you came in. You need to get out now because they're going to come to get you. They don't want this story to get out. And thank goodness he'd come in on the train. Someone drove him to the next town and then he took a bus back to Washington, D.C. So just to tell you that, you know, when you're talking about reporting and reporting about injustice, a lot of times your own personal life as a reporter could be in danger. But Durham supported his reporters, and everybody I interviewed and talked to about this period of his life when he was the editor said that he was the best writer, and they learned how to write from seeing his example and the way he edited their pieces. So he does that until 1969, and then he gets a chance to finally work in television. And he works on a black drama series called Bird of the Iron Feather, and the title comes from a speech from Frederick Douglass, which I talk about in the book. And it's a one of its kind, kind of the first of its kind drama show on television about Black people, Black families, and the Black community. There's a lot of intrigue and craziness that goes on behind the scenes, and then it finally gets on the air in January of 1970. They expect for it to stay on for at least 6 months. It becomes the top viewed show on WTTW in Chicago at the time, and then they take it off the air in less than 3 months. Why? Again, we talk about the politics of the time, the fact that Durham and his philosophy and the way that he had his fellow writers, at least this time, he knew he couldn't write it all by himself, so he had staff writers. They were just a bit too radical, and so they were taken off the air before they continued their radical bent. But it was his opportunity to work in another medium, and a medium that he had wanted to work in back in the 40s. So now we're in the 70s, and as a result of his work with Muhammad Speaks, the nation comes to him and says, you know, we want Muhammad Ali to try to get some money by having his autobiography published. And we want you to be the credited ghostwriter. And he says yes, and he writes the greatest. Okay, and here's Ali in the 60s when, right before he was banned from fighting because he refused to be inducted into the Army. And this is Muhammad Ali and Richard Durham in Muhammad Ali's house talking about the book and all. And this is them. Mrs. Durham couldn't remember exactly where they were, but this was somewhere in Europe after he had finished a fight. And finally, I talk about the intrigue of the behind the scenes of getting the book written. By the way, his editor, the book was acquired by Random House, a major publisher in New York City, and his editor, his senior editor, was a woman who you may and should have heard of, Pulitzer Prize, Nobel Prize winner, Toni Morrison. And so I had the wonderful opportunity to interview Toni, and she said Richard Durham was a wonderful writer, and the only problem she had with him was that he wouldn't give her the manuscript. He kept promising, it's coming tomorrow, and tomorrow never came. Or when there was at one point where the editor said, look, we have to have something. We've given you, both you and Ali, this major advance, and we need to get this book off the shelf because we think it's going to be a bestseller, given who Muhammad Ali is. And he said, okay, it's coming. And he would give her, at one point, they wanted the completed manuscript and he only had 100 pages. And he was like, this will not do. You got to do better. But what he turned in was just so good that any thought of getting another writer to move the process along wasn't part of it. So finally, in 1975, after Muhammad Ali finally went to Zaire, fought George Foreman, and then won the championship back, the book was published. And this is a copy of the German translation of the book. It was translated into several languages and really sold pretty well. And so that was his ghostwriting experience, but he also wrote several other books, including the autobiography of a Mexican-American actor named Anthony Quinn. And so he was a ghostwriter for that. Fast forward to the early 80s, and he had become friends with Harold Washington back in the 40s. And when Harold decided to run for mayor in an attempt to become the first black mayor of the city of Chicago, everybody said, you need Durham to work with you and to help you frame your media campaign. And so this is a picture of Durham with his head down in the back, writing on the pad. And he followed Harold Washington around. He wrote several of his speeches. And of course, Harold Washington was successful and became the first black mayor in 1983. Unfortunately, Durham didn't live much longer than that. He died the next year, and he didn't want to become a member of Harold Washington's regime. But Washington would often go over to Clarice, that was Richard's wife, and Richard's house and just get, sit at his feet and, get advice and ask for, things that he should do media-wise. And so that gives you in a nutshell what this man was about. But he basically was all about positive social change, using your words, using writing to deal with freedom, justice, and equality in the best possible way. And that's what this book is all about. So, thank you.
Is there any other discussion or?
I think if there are questions that probably need to be directed at Sonja.
Well, I have a question that I think I'd like to hear from both of you about, because you touched on the divide between, or not divide, but the fact that as a Southern-based activist and writer, and that you were not as familiar with what was going on in Chicago. So, what explains that? I mean, just a little bit more, maybe to help those of us who, the history behind that, like why there were these two different strains of activism, activist journalism going on, and I guess then bringing that into contemporary times. How do you see that shaping the way journalism is done now and the way activism is done now? Because we have major activism going on in the Midwest now, coming out of the St. Louis region. Other areas, it seems like it's uniting more over social media, but do you see some continuation of that kind of distinctive Midwest style of doing things and a distinctive Southern style of doing things, and how do you see those things kind of coming together over time?
No. Sure. I don't know. I don't know if they're two different strains. Talking about most of the reporters, black reporters, certainly those of us involved in civil rights struggle, community organizing in the South encountered, were from the North for the most part. Although Atlanta, Birmingham, New Orleans, there were significant Southern black presses. But you're talking about national exposure generated by black reporting. They were coming from vehicles like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, the Afro-American, I forget the one in Cleveland, Los Angeles. So in that sense, people I've encountered, say, Larry Still comes immediately to mind because he was in Mississippi fairly regularly, and others. Sort of one level in my head from up north. But if you talk about the issues, certainly in the 1960s and going back, affecting black people, I think until recently, the South has always driven. The Southern experience is what is driven. The black sense of disenfranchisement, and the black sense of what your obligations were in terms of the fight for full citizenship. I think that shifted somewhat since the 60s, in the sense the black community is much more urban than it was, certainly in Durham's time. That's where the population is. That was secondly, it's not only much more urban in general, but the South is has integrated back into the country. A friend of mine in Mississippi used to say, when you're in Mississippi, rest of America doesn't seem real. And when you're in the rest of America, Mississippi doesn't seem real. And this is a comment he's making, and then I don't think that's just true anymore. If you drive to Clarksdale and look at it, you see like the suburban developments that look just like the ones here. So the South, it seems to me, has reintegrated in some ways back into the country. So there's a different dynamic in terms of how if you talk to, say, the young people involved with Black Lives Matter, or the young people involved with Moral Mondays here in North Carolina, their sense of where the black community is, I mean, they really are talking about struggle in inner cities, police violence. It's not to say the South doesn't have its own issues. I think there's a different dynamic at play here. It's a long, involved conversation. I don't want to burden the people around this table with. But I only want to make the point that during Durham's time, or even during my own time in the 1960s in Mississippi, we really talked about black struggle and focused on your obligations in terms of black liberation, if you will. In many ways, you were talking about the South. I think that is less true now.
And I think that if Durham had been alive now and in his prime, he'd be using social media to do the same thing that he did in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and beyond. That he would use it to expose issues and talk about what was happening and to try to organize and to inspire people to push for change.
When I listen to Destination Freedom, I've listened to just some of the program that's on the website there. It reminds me, I think this is the first podcast. I mean, this is really, with the part you were just playing, I think about the podcasts that I listen to now, and I mean, it was a really amazingly forward-thinking way of getting those stories out.
Yeah, everyone that I talked to worked with him said he was really ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
So as historians, what's the balance that you find between focusing on what was progressive in Richard Durham's time as being this cutting-edge black journalist, and then I went to a talk on intersectionality, and they're using the quote that's been on posts on shirts, this ain't your mother's or grandmother's civil rights movement, and how the balance that's potentially needs to be struck between looking at what's been done in the past, but making sure that it is cutting edge for this day and age. But what, as historians and current people who are involved in the everyday today, how does that balance strike you?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a historian.
Oh.
I don't know if you would. I'm a media person, but I love history. And of course, his story is part of that history. But I think that if you look at his story and his life in context with what was happening then, that you would probably think or see that it could apply now. One of the things about Durham that I didn't really talk about, but I do kind of deal with in the book, is that he read everything. He was leftist, but he read the right, he read the middle, he read the leftist literature. He schooled himself, even though he went to Northwestern briefly, but it was the Depression, so he couldn't finish his college education. And if he had a regret at all, he said that it would have been that he didn't finish his college experience. But what he did was he went ahead and taught himself. So he looked at the writings of Du Bois and of course Langston Hughes and others, and he then tried to incorporate the lessons from those writers and of course of experiences in the past to how that would be in contemporary America. So I think it's, even now, the Black Lives Matter movement, this is a continuum. Some people may say, okay, this is new and it's just happening now because of this police brutality environment we seem to be in, but it really is a continuum that dates back. And that if you study the history, I think you can learn from that, which is, I think, what we do. Yeah.
I just want to say, I think it's easier. One thing that's true, I think, particularly with respect to the movements today that are being driven by young people, that it's easier today to connect to the history that has preceded. Some of that has to do with the emergence of social media. Some of that has to do with the broader ease of communication nowadays. And that makes, I think, an important difference. This ability now to reach out to both people and experiences from the past and pick out of that what might be useful today.
Excuse me. My question is, this guy, apparently he was very important, but he passed away. Okay, for current, did anyone like journalists compare with him or are still alive today?
The other, I'm sorry.
Are there any journalists like him who are still alive today? You mean from his era?
Not necessarily compare with his accomplishments and with his talent, which can give a few names or could you like to?
I think there are journalists today who are similar to Durham in terms of the kind of commitment that they have. I think it may be harder today to access some of these media institutions, radio, and television, and newspapers than it was earlier, even factoring in race and the kind of discrimination that existed racially, say, in Durham's time. I think media institutions today take far fewer chances. I think media institutions today are bigger and more complex, less accessible than they might have been. I don't know, I haven't quite made up my mind about that. I just think it would be harder, for instance, to have, even for 3 months, a show like Durham's in Chicago.
It probably would be on traditional media, but the great thing on social media, you have, if you can create a website, you can do that. Or if you go into certain social media platform, you can then get your information out. The issue is that there are so many social media outlets that how do you cut through the multitudes and get people to come to your site or your Instagram page. I don't know, but I think that it is harder for traditional media. You have a little bit more cachet or access if you're using social media. And the question is just how do you get your audience? Any other questions or thoughts?
So this is such an intensive look at a singular person, and I was just wondering, this is more of a personal thing, but in doing all of this research about Richard Durham, is there anything that really was imparted on you that informs the other work that you do or involved with, or that has affected your perception or how you approach things?
That's a good question. I think what drew me to him was the fact that, well, one, I hadn't heard of him, and then when I listened to his radio work, I was just blown away because it was so insightful, compelling, and inspiring as a radio writer. So I think what it showed me is that you can be, and this is something that I've always thought about for my work, is that you can present information, you can tell a story, but the story can also be compelling and educational. And if you are as skilled as he was, and you can learn to be as skilled as he was, but because it's about storytelling, and people love stories. And somehow you have to figure out a way, is what I learned, to be able to connect a story that someone has no interest in at all And yet, in the way you present it, if it's a drama, how that drama is presented. If it's news, how you write the news. If it's a combination of all of the above. It's using the medium to capture the audience and then hopefully holding them so that they get the information, and it might be almost sometimes uncovered. That you've got this wonderful, slick, dramatic story, but underneath, the philosophy underneath it is really about positive change and, and information and inspiration. So that's what I learned, and that's what I took away from